is a recording of a panel from the event Storycrafting Sessions Fantasy, a free one-day virtual conference hosted by the Weeknight Writers Group in partnership with Renaissance Press. To learn more about the Weeknight Writers Group, you can go to businessforauthors.com/weeknight-writers, and to learn more about Renaissance Press, you can go to pressesrenaissancepress.ca. Hello, everyone. Hello, Kitty.
Yeah, now you see Moriko. She's also a tuxie.
He was like, oh, things are starting. I need to make sure I'm part of the recording.
Yep.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fantasy as a Safe Space panel. I'm super excited to be here today and to discuss exploring political and social themes in fantasy. But before we get into that, we do have a little bit of housekeeping to do. First up, be sure to join the Discord server. I've just posted a link in the chat. That is a place where we can continue the conversation around this panel. There will also be conversations around other panels, an area for general socializing, and an area where you can see panelist links and find out more about our panelists. The other thing I do want to mention is that these events are free, but there are costs involved in running them. And specifically, we currently have a fundraising goal to raise funds for transcriptions so that we can publish these videos to YouTube in a timely manner instead of the several months behind that we have been for our last couple of events. So the best way to do that, there are two options. You can make a one-time contribution to our Ko-fi page, or you can join our sustaining membership program, which will also give you the ability to vote on panel topics for future events and other perks, like you can join our premium Discord server with weekly, daily, and monthly writing and marketing check-ins and much more. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get started. Can we get everyone to introduce yourselves, your name, your pronouns, and just a little bit about you and what you write? Does anyone want to go first?
I'll go first then. Hello there, I'm Micah. Pronouns are they, them. I live in New Zealand. It's the 3 a.m. over here. I've just been awake for a little bit. I actually usually write sci-fi, but this year I launched a new endeavor to build a fantasy world, and what an exciting thing that was. So yeah, I'll be talking a little bit about the world that I built for two characters, Pickle and Jewel.
Awesome. Gabby, do you want to go next?
Sure. My name's Gabby. I use she, her pronouns. I write primarily YA fantasy. Was there more information I was supposed to share?
I mean, if you want to be a little more specific about your YA fantasy, like,
sure. Yeah,
when
okay.
it's coming out, that's exciting.
Yes. My debut YA fantasy novel is called Sing Me to Sleep, and it's about a Black Siren who lives in a world of a bunch of fae, and I'll talk more about that a bit later, but that comes out in spring 2023.
Very exciting. Who wants to go next?
Okay. My name's Joe Howard, he, him. I'm in the UK, and I mainly write horror. I write horror fantasy as well, and I do sort of political and social opinion piece journalism as well. So this particular issue is quite hot for me in terms of the stuff that I write fairly regularly, especially in light of the crazy stuff's happening in the world at the moment and in the UK, which is a particularly strange place to live right now.
Yeah, there's some stuff going on over there.
It's madness, I tell you.
Astrid?
Hi, my name is Astrid. They, she, and feel free to use any neo pronouns with me. I don't mind. I typically write fantasy or urban fantasy. I tend to write more towards the middle grade side of things. I am also writing fan fiction right now, Naruto fan fiction, because I have absolutely zero shame. I'm also an autistic, ADHD and queer writer, so I write very, very diverse stuff.
Awesome. So let's start with some basic definitions. When fantasy is described as a safe space, what does that actually mean to you? What is a safe space in this context? Don't all leap up at once now.
I think, well, I'll get going. You would think the 3 a.m. person would be given a bit of a break, but no. So for myself, I don't know about the other authors. I know there's a question on this a little bit, but in building up your story world, often we'll kind of use like a historical setting as filler. So we'll do a little bit of historical research, and for things like how people went to the toilet, what they ate, how they ate, for instance. It's often really, really useful to kind of pick an era, pick all that. That's great background. Problem is, you often go back in history, and a lot of our ancestors were racist, homophobic, all that kind of, it's kind of gets ugly as you go by. Just a little bit. So it's about making a world that people feel that they can be represented as the individuals that they're in. That it's not that it's not quite as brutal and as horrible as it really is. And because if you want to talk to me about the antithesis of an environment that feels like a safe space, that would be Game of Thrones, which feels historically brutal, but it's not really an area where you go, oh, you know what, I'd really love to live in Westeros. No one really says that. People would like to say live in Middle Earth or Narnia for all their problems. So it's really having a safe space means that it's an enjoyable fantasy. It's not a brutal horror thing. And maybe Joe, as a horror writer, has some theories about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I hear exactly that. I suppose, like, in terms of horror, like I wrote a sort of a philosophy book around why horror is one of the most powerful genres in the world, including fantasy horror, because there's so much depth and layers and meaning within it that draw out significant political and social themes. You can, I mean, it's all there if you want it to be there. I argue within the horror genre that you can pull out so much stuff and meaning and depth and understanding what it means to be human, about our place in the world, about some of the significant things that impact us as human beings through history. Really, the kind of the common themes that seem to keep coming up, no matter how long down this journey that we go. I suppose in terms of fantasy as a safe space, for me, I was having a conversation with my 11-year-old, and she said to me, "I love writing fantasy, Dad." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I can go anywhere and do anything I want." And I thought, wow, that's really significant in the sense that there is so much scope in terms of what you can do and create worlds that are, as you just said, that are safe for people to be in, but also in light of everything that's going on at the moment in the world, we're all dealing with collectively kind of a lot of trauma and grief at the moment in light of the last couple of years of the pandemic, but also in terms of the way the world is changing and the climate crisis and everything that's happening right now. It feels like a really scary world to be in, and actually fantasy creates a world potentially for us to actually escape for a bit, but also to deal with themes that in a way that can be less triggering for people. I think there's a lot that's really hard for us to take, that really trigger, and a lot of stuff that's really impacting us internally and emotionally, and fantasy can kind of challenge and deal with some of those themes, but in a way that perhaps isn't as emotionally disruptive as what the real world is. It doesn't mean that you can't deal with stuff, but it means that you can deal with it in a way that doesn't disrupt us quite as much as real life does at the moment. That's where I'd say right now.
Astrid, do you have thoughts on this?
I don't have much thoughts on horror.
Well, on
My
the actual
brain kind of-
question, the defining fantasy as a safe space, what does that
Okay.
actually mean?
Okay, is too early.
What time zone are you in?
I'm the Eastern time is just I don't like waking up that early, but I mean at 10. At
Fair
10,
enough.
I woke up at 10. So that's I'm very much not awake. But fantasy is like a safe space for me. It's just like, you know, you can escape the world. You know, our world right now is absolute chaos. But going and writing, whether I'm working on my book or even my fan fiction, it keeps me don't want to say sane, but it keeps me maybe it gives me a sense of control because I can't control anything else. So like for me, it's, you know, I can control the chaos that I'm putting myself in. And you can also, this also goes for reading too, is where, you know, at least in the story, you know, you're choosing to be there, and half the time it's not even as the chaos you read or you're writing is not as bad as what's going on in real life. So for me, that's like, you know, I guess fantasy as a safe space for me is just like I can control where I put myself.
So honestly, these days I feel like even the world of Game of Thrones is kind of less chaotic than real life.
I definitely identify with that as writing as an escape place during the last 2 years. Absolutely.
Oh goodness, yes.
Absolutely.
Gabby, your thoughts on fantasy as a safe space?
Yeah, I very much agree that it's very much like escapism. It kind of makes bad things easier to swallow. Like, would you rather read about bad things happening like next door, you know, one state over, or would you rather read about, you know, girls and swords who happen to be dealing with issues that like are relatable to what we're experiencing now? Personally, I'd rather read about girls with swords, just like a way where you can think about, I guess you can kind of choose to either think about it through a lens of present day issues, historical issues, or think about it more as like, this is fun, there's a dragon, that's exciting. And I just think it makes it a lot more fun, where you can kind of choose how seriously you take it. So yeah, I think it just makes it easier to swallow.
Absolutely. And I mean, the other thing too is we get to choose whether or not our characters, you know, are actually able to challenge the system. And usually we choose, yes, they actually are able to change things, which is, you know, not something we can really decide for ourselves. We can try, but we have a limited ability to actually enact the change we want to see. So what are some of your favorite examples of stories that use fantasy worlds to explore social and political themes relevant to our own world? Let's go in reverse order this time. So we'll start with Gabby.
Sure. Okay. I think 3 of my favorite ones are The Bells by Danielle Clayton, the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, and Cinderella is Dead by Kaylin Barron. They're all like take a second world, and even though like they feel very different from our own, I think a lot of where you can see like, oh, this is like what they're critiquing is in like what this like new world kind of values, which is like really interesting to me. The first one that comes to mind with the ones that I just said, like for The Bells, like there's this value of beauty, and just kind of like that's what the world has decided matters, and the way that she kind of uses that to critique our own society, I think is really powerful. But just in general, when I read like second world fantasy, I'm always thinking about what are they critiquing, how are they critiquing it, and usually it's in who has power, why do they have the power that they have, yeah, so those are three that I just really enjoy, and I think they're all really beautifully written, as well as very different from our own world, to the point where it is super easy to, at least for me, like going back to like the idea of escapism, it is very easy to just kind of get lost in it and just be like horrified, like, oh my God, this is horrible. And then you think more and you're like, wait, but also this is horrible. But I think you can pick and choose how to take it. And of course, they're just beautifully written and fun.
Yeah,
But
I
yeah,
have read 2 out of 3 of those, and I will definitely agree on the Bells and the Broken Earth trilogy. Although I will say, don't read the Broken Earth trilogy without a box of tissues handy. You're
no, don't
gonna
do
need it.
No, don't do it. I had to like take breaks while reading it, like so many breaks where I would just be like, okay, I'm gonna go cry over there now. I'll come back to this later. But it was great.
Yeah, I bought them. So I borrowed them when I first read them, and then I bought them and intending to reread them, and then a whole pandemic happened, and I just haven't been able to bring myself to, because they are pretty devastating.
That's fair. Yeah, totally fair.
Astrid, do you have some stories you can share that examine social and political themes well in fantasy worlds?
I've admittedly not been able to read very well the past few years, just because too much going on, and also ADHD brain life. But I will share like stories like, you know, what I watch in TV and stuff. Like actually, no, that's not a good example. It's hard to go with that based on, like, it's hard for me to read these days, but I'm thinking like
TV shows and heck, even video games, they all count as stories. They're
I
all
mean,
welcome here.
I mean, actually, thinking about it, like, I haven't read many comics, but my dad does, and a lot of those do have the tendency to talk about or like talk about the time that they're in. I can't like name specific examples, but sometimes it'll come up in comics, and TV shows. I'm thinking like, dang, what's the last one? I can't think of that now.
Should we circle back to you?
Uh,
Do you know what
no,
to think?
I just remembered I did read Amari and the Night Brothers, and the author of that did talk about like racism a little bit and tackling that. Wow, my brain is absolutely dead. Please come back to me now.
All right, we can circle back to you. Joe, do you have some stories that you can recommend here?
Yeah, well, I'm a big Clive Barker fan, actually. I love all his stuff, Imagica, Galilee, Hellraiser, Great and Secret Show. There's loads of examples in his writing in terms that deal. So like Galilee deals with racism, and in terms of the way in which society is structured against Black and brown people, and it's really interesting to see the way he deals with that. Also, as well, that I mean, Jordan Peele does it quite well in Get Out, when he talks when in that sort of horror environment, how the Black and brown people are fetishized, and how white people in their dominance within Jordan Peele's world are trying to use certain ideas around other people, and create a world in which they're trying to control and dominate in a way that completely dehumanizes the other person. And Clive Barker deals with that quite well in Galilee. It's a really interesting take. It's a fantasy world in which he's building, and yet he deals with these issues around dehumanization and racism in really powerful ways. But for me as well, there's in Imagica, he's dealing with social issues and structures and class, and the way in which societies are built on different class systems. And I think that's, for me, that's a really powerful insight into into the world in which we live, in terms of, I mean, the UK is quite unbelievable, really, that we're in 2022, and the issues of class are more dominant now than they have been for a very, very long time. And I think, you know, the gap between rich and poor is at the most it's been in probably 300 years. And in terms of the way in which society is structured right now in the UK, and I think you sort of see similar things happening in the US, it's unbelievable to be living in this time and witnessing these things going on. And so for fantasy writers and horror writers to be able to draw attention to these very real issues is really powerful and really important. But really disconcerting as well, the fact that we are even still having these conversations. That, you know, I mean, I'm currently, you know, in the UK, we're celebrating the Jubilee, you know, like, because someone's born into wealth and obscene privilege, and we all get like a holiday and have to like wave flags and cheer this woman who's sitting on a golden throne while kids can't eat, or, you know, families can't heat their homes. It's just really bizarre to be living in this time. And so to be able to have opportunities to challenge and to call attention to these things through fantasy, you know, so for me, Clive Barker's done that really well. And actually, I'd also say, like with Hellraiser, a lot of what's going on with that particular story is that he's calling attention to the power of knowledge, and how knowledge can be, well, the way in which knowledge is used for both good and for bad, but also in the way in which people try and take away your power to have knowledge. You know, actually, you know, the power of truth and knowledge, to be educated, to understand what's going on in the world. How we have so many powerful institutions and media corporations that actually try and deny us the power to have knowledge. You know, fill our minds with distraction and lies, rather than allowing us to see what's really going on. And so for me, yeah, Clive Barker's really good at kind of in all those kinds of ways in the fantasy worlds that he builds.
Awesome. Yeah, I've read a little bit of Clive Barker, and honestly, mostly I just remember it being really disturbing, because the one that I read was Weave World, and one of the villains is like walking around with like the ghosts of her aborted twin sisters. It's really demented. Can I actually ask you, and Gabby, can I also ask you to just type in the names of the books that you recommended, just so that people can make sure that they have the spelling correct if they're looking for them. And Micah, do you have any stories that you can mention here?
Certainly do. You might just have to shut me up though. So kind of building on from a theme from Joe, about the Queen and how, you know, a whole country that sometimes obsesses on who's sitting on the throne. So much as fantasy, particularly kind of, I think, pre-80s, is all about some kid who lives on a farm who has a magical destiny in front of him and becomes king at the end, and everything's great. It's almost like a version of the Arthurian legend of, you know, get a really good person, put them on the throne, and they'll be wonderful. One guy in particular I felt kind of kicked that bucket over was Terry Pratchett, yeah? So Terry Pratchett's Discworld is really interesting. It starts off as just a parody fantasy world, which is just kind of swords and sorcery gone a bit crazy. And then for a while, he starts kind of working in, I'm going to work through most of the Shakespeare plays and do equivalents on Discworld. But then he starts to really get a kind of glue of his world and starts playing around with it a bit. And you know, throughout the book series, there's this kind of theme of people kind of being a bit dumb, but when they're in crowds, they're the most dumb, yeah? And a kind of scary kind of mob. And then from there on, he starts working this in and starts working in themes to explore things. I know in Jingo, for instance, there's this whole or is it the Lost Continent? I think it's the Lost Continent. Sorry, there's this new land that just appears, and everyone naturally goes to war about it. You know, so two countries just go to war because that's the kind of thing that they do. To me, one of the most important ones was his exploration of dwarf society, which it's kind of like a throwaway detail that's in J.R.R. Tolkien's, and he goes, you know, in dwarf society, you know, women and men both have beards, and most people can't tell the difference. And Terry Pratchett picks this up and he just runs with it, and he creates a society where basically everyone is kind of trying to display as masculine, but actually quite a few people are actually feminine. And there is one dwarf that goes through and actually, turns out to be female and starts exploring the feminine side. And it kind of like sets a ripple off of themes throughout the whole series of books. And I don't know if he was Terry Pratchett was meaning to explore trans themes there, but they're definitely there. And I just kind of really loved it, and kind of like, this idea of gender identity was just worked so playfully, but so kind of, this is really cool, yeah, for me. And there's loads of things that he does like that. He'll introduce a new he introduces something called the clacks, which is a kind of semaphore system. Before you know it, hits a commentary on how we use mobile phones. It's constant. And there's just a real kind of, he introduces these things, looks at racism. There's, for instance, is it the dwarves and the trolls have been at war for ages and they don't like each other? But then he kind of, there's a book where it looks at the history of that and how it was actually a mistake, and the perception of it being a problem has actually become a problem, and just a lot of fantastic stuff. But the problem is when
I'm gonna say finish your thought and then
I will do. Don't worry. I think the problem with Terry Pratchett is often people say, "Oh, I'm interested in starting," but if you start at the start, the problem is the books quite a bit later down the line get better, yeah, and you don't really see that in the early books.
Yeah, there's definitely less social commentary in the early books, although I do still find them to be a lot of fun. I own like 15 Discworld books, which is like a third of them. Astrid, I'm going to circle back to you. Do you have some stories you can recommend here with interesting social and political themes? And again, TV shows and video games are totally welcome.
I was thinking more about Amari and the Knight brothers. Amari is 12-year-old Black girl, and this I haven't finished it, but I remember early on it was talked about how, like, she's in this, not a prep school, I think she's in a private school. She got into it on like a scholarship or something. And I think they do discuss sometimes about how like there's a more pressure on her because she's Black, and she's got to think about all these other things that us white people, we don't have to think about, because we have privileges that Black people don't. And he does talk about that because the author is Black, so obviously he's going to talk about that, and he should, and it needs to be discussed. And I can't think of any specific examples from the book, but I just remember like that. I remember that clearly, where he was talking about that, and I think he does continue to talk about it. But as I said, I didn't have a chance to finish it, but it was I wish I had more on that subject to say, but I like when authors talk about that kind of thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the next question. So why do you think that fantasy specifically is such a good genre for this kind of exploration? Why does it work so well for exploring social and political themes? And anyone can pick this up first if whoever wants it.
I'll start, and I'll keep it really quick. I think because it's a blank slate, and you can only, with any kind of world building, you only need to bring into it what you're actually prepared to run with. Yeah. So, if for myself, for instance, I've used Restoration Britain as my filler, my background thing for my world building. and you look at it and it was racist and homophobic. There's a little bit of anti-species thing, so not surprising. Half orcs and half orcs aren't particularly welcome most places, and compared to the period, which was if you were gay you'd be hung. I don't need to bring that in, so that's not there. And likewise, some of the brutal corporal punishment I've etched down, because that doesn't feel safe, particularly when you've got a petty thief as a main character.
I think too, since it's something that you're making up, it's not necessarily, I think it was Mike that brought up earlier, the idea of like history, like you get to make the history what you want as opposed to being tied to like our own history. So you can focus on more what you want. I think if you're writing something in a present day context, there are a lot of different things that maybe you want to focus on. I don't know, highlighting something like income inequality. Well, there are so many different layers to any one person's identity that's based in history. If you wanted to explore that, if you make your own like historical, if you make your own fantastical world, you're not tied to our history. You can kind of make it your own. And the world can be based in something else so that you can highlight more that specific issue and you don't have to kind of touch on other things. Slash, you can touch on a lot of other things that maybe you wouldn't otherwise be able to. I think too, in terms of critiquing, for example, a specific person, you don't need to call out just like, I don't know, a specific senator, a specific monarch. You can make it fake so that you know what you're critiquing. You can make them more of a caricature of the things that really bug you about that person without necessarily calling them out, which I think kind of goes back to why it's kind of a safer space where it's fake, it's not real, but you know who you're calling out. And I think that's a fun aspect of it that makes it feel safer.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think as well, because we are all children of our culture, like we are. That's, there's no getting away from that. Now we can kick back, as Mike's eloquently described there, kick back at some of the disgraceful things that our culture has created, and some of the ways in which you look at, some of the attitudes and behaviours that you look at within our culture today and in the past that have permeated. I've been to kind of family gatherings and that, and you sort of think to yourself, are people actually saying these things out loud? Are these things, but those kinds of quiet, kind of behind the door attitudes seem to have seeped out publicly into the collective consciousness, where people are saying things out loud now that were previously said behind closed doors, and you think, well, what's going on? But because we're children of our culture and we're influenced by certain things that happen politically and socially going on around us. Whereas, so fantasy, you have an opportunity of creating, like it's been said, that blank slate, but creating children of a culture that has yet to exist, and that you can build a world in which you can, some might call it utopian or ideological, but you can build a world in which people make sense of who they are in light of the history that's gone on, that's beyond the world in which we live. And that can be a really powerful thing to do. I mean, to be able to create characters that are anchored within maybe social justice, or within equality, or within the desire for the common good, that's a powerful world that you can create, and that you can have a society. And in one of my stories, in one of my books, I've got kind of a community and a society that is anchored within those ideas and within those concepts, and what a world and a community could look like if it was built out of that. So for me, I think that's a really powerful concept, and a really powerful tool that we've got, because you can, for me, it's like you can literally go wherever your brain can take you. Like, there are no limits here to what can be done in fantasy world. And that's what's really exciting for me, because we're not constrained by anything. Like, literally nothing can constrain you. You can bend anything, laws and physics and culture, and anything can be created wherever your imagination can take you. And that includes social and political themes. So for me, that's really exciting.
that actually, I have like a quick thing on that.
Go ahead.
Because for me, like my debut, it's a fantastical world. All the characters are Black and brown because it was like really important to me to have a world that's for Black and brown people, like that it's outside of like the white gaze. And just like you talking about like children of culture, like the way that you were raised, the way that you were viewed, the world that you live in is based on the people around you. And I just thought it'd be really interesting to think about a world in which that's not something you have to take into account. So just that's what that made me think of. And I think that's a really good and interesting point.
Awesome. Astrid, do you have any thoughts on this?
I was what Micah had said earlier, the world is, or like in fantasy, you have a blank slate. And I agree with that idea because like he said, you can do anything and you can create anything and you can go whatever direction you want to go. And and adding political themes and stuff like that where you're talking about the current world, you can do it in a way where you don't, like, maybe even your audience quite, like, if they're casually reading it, they're not going to actually realize it's a criticism of how things are right now if you do it right. And then the not so casual reader is going to read into it like, wow, we're talking about that kind of thing. And fantasy is great for that because you can, like Micah and Joe and had said, anything goes and you can make caricatures of stuff. I just created in my Naruto fan fiction a Trump and Musk character, so that's absolutely fun. I get to play with that. I like being able to play with that kind of thing, and fantasy is a great way to do that. I feel like I'm repeating what people said. I'm sorry.
That's all right. We are running a bit longer than I thought we would at this point. So I'm just going to ask one more of my questions, and then we're going to move into audience questions. We've already got a couple, but if people have more questions, please do leave them in the chat, and we will get to as many as we can here, and then we can move the conversation to the Discord. So the final thing that I want to ask before we move to audience questions is, what are some ways that you've explored social and political themes in your own fantasy stories? And Gabby, you already kind of talked about this a little bit, so let's pass the mic back to you and you can expand on that.
Oh, sure. So my world is all Black and brown characters, like I said earlier, which one allows for all of the characters to again exist outside of like a white gaze. They're just kind of things that you're allowed to do, things that you don't have the pressure of necessarily feeling if you're outside of that space. But then also I think
can I pause for a second just to ask you to expand on the idea of the white gaze just a little bit for people who might not be familiar?
Yeah, sorry. Absolutely. I think one of the main things, I talked to my agent about this a lot actually, was, so my main character is a siren. Something that I always loved as a kid was swimming. I never felt comfortable doing it competitively, just because of my hair, something I'm still very self-conscious about. So just in terms of like the white gaze, it's the way that you kind of feel in spaces with majority white people, or even just one white person. That's kind of the basis of it, just because there are kind of power structures that exist. So if you're in a space with white people, there's a way that you feel as a minority. So for me, something that was important about her character and the characters in the story is that they're allowed to be. She loves water the way that I do. She loves to swim. She never feels self-conscious about natural hair or anything like that, being naturally beautiful and feeling that way. And that was something that was important for me, for her to feel, for her to be able to be free of that. But yeah, so in terms of kind of dissecting, looking into our world and critiquing it, something too that I wanted to explore. So she's the only siren in her world, and she's kind of masquerading, pretending to be a fae, which everyone else in her society is. And so the thing that they've decided that they value is more, so for her, she's considered less than. The fae are the ones who are in power, and there are these kind of arbitrary restrictions on what you're allowed to do dependent on what you are. And so for me, when we're thinking about how do you kind of critique our current world, again, it goes back to the idea of what do you value? And oftentimes I think the things that societies value in fantastical worlds are very arbitrary. Like it's just kind of one person decided this is what matters, and so they kind of impose that on everyone else. And I think that's in my book and a lot of fantasy books, what they do, you pick something that they decide this is what we're going to focus on, and they make it everyone else's problem, and you just kind of have to feed into that. And I think looking at books and fantasy, not even just books, any kind of story through that lens of what is this society focusing on, is just kind of how you can look at what that author or creator was trying to critique.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Who wants to go next? Micah?
No, Mike. Micah?
No, Joe, you go first.
Okay.
I'll follow.
So one of the themes that I'm very passionate about that is around the idea of scapegoating, and looking back through sort of human history in terms of how that kind of is tied in with religion and sacrifice and taboo and ritual, and the way in which society or early human communities and through history, we've always found someone to scapegoat, and in order to place the anxieties and the violence and the wrath of a community upon a victim. And it doesn't matter whether they're guilty or not. The whole point of a scapegoat is that they are an oddity. They're seen to be an oddity within society, a personal people that we can dispel all our fear and our violence upon. And it restores this kind of fragile peace within a community. And you know, there's kind of sacrificial sites that are like been found at about 10,000 BC on the Turkey-Syrian border, that shows that human beings, for as long as we've been kind of something called community, we've scapegoated, and we've done it consistently. And you don't have to look too far in human history at all, and even today, to see how that continues. In the UK, for instance, we're continuing to scapegoat black and brown people and people who are seeking asylum here. I mean, it's just, you know, I mean, we've got this horrific policy right now where we're going to deport people to Rwanda. You know, I mean, it's like, are we actually living in this time where this is actually happening in this country, in the UK, in a Western country? But it is, and so scapegoating has been around as long as human people have been around. And so for me, this is one of the themes that I've wanted to pick up in my own fantasy writing. And so my book, it's going to be out in a couple of years, explores these themes around scapegoating and around in which blood is really important to human culture and human societies, where we shed blood in order to gain some kind of peace. So we've always killed in order to get peace, and if you look through history, we've just always done that. And so this book that I've written explores that a lot, really, and really kind of focuses in this idea of blood sacrifice and scapegoating, and why people do that, and the motivations behind that, and the lessons of which we can learn out of that. Now, it's not a book that preaches like this message or anything. It's there for eyes to see, hopefully, and for those that don't want to see, it's hopefully just a really good story. But for me, that's a really important theme that I come back to a lot in my kind of opinion piece journalism that I write. I come back to this a lot, and in my kind of non-fiction stuff that I write, I explore these issues a lot because I think they're really, really important. I mean, I've even done seminars where people have recognised that they've scapegoated work employees, you know, that there is kind of a light goes on and they go, oh my goodness, that's what we did to that person. That's what we did. They had done nothing wrong, but we just scapegoated them because we had a problem at work. How do you deal with that problem? Well, we blame it all on one person and get rid of them. And it happens all the time. And actually, when you open your eyes to see it, it's everywhere. and it's about how do we actually confront that and tackle that.
Well said. Micah?
For myself, I looked at, as I was saying, I was looking at a few areas of history, and for me, Restoration Britain kind of was intriguing because it was an area when Britain became a little bit more tolerant, and it became more tolerant not because of ideals, but out of need. A lot of people had died in the Civil War, and wouldn't you know, there was a pandemic of a plague going around, and all of a sudden, kind of the doors open to allow the kind of people that they didn't quite like before into cities and stuff. And I went, that's interesting from a fantasy perspective. That's a good thing for saying, okay, you've got a human only country, and suddenly they're kind of going to start letting what some people would call the riffraff in, the halflings, the dwarves, the elves who've always kind of been worshipped. And you can tell the desperation that they even let in the orcs, and kind of using that as kind of a dynamic. I think for me, perhaps one of the more darker things that are themed, there's one character who's by necessity had to leave the village because the plague has overrun the thing, and I used quite a lot of Eam as a background for that. But you know, there was a kind of mob mentality and kind of using that, and they kind of drove out the one group who actually was dealing very well with the plague, because if they're not dying in droves from the plague, they must have caused it. That kind of, funnily enough, that same scapegoating that Joe was using, and that's been very interesting to explore, but also the dynamics between races. And one particularly important thing. So a lot of people in this cosmopolitan city that it's set in, the halflings try and hide their ears so that they look more like human children. Dwarves go around and they're wearing ridiculous platforms and shaving off the beards to look more human. Everyone's trying to pass as human. There's like a quote, everyone tries to pass. Yeah. Even orcs that try and hide the nose and kind of change the color of the skin just so that they look a little bit more, they pass a bit more. And to which one of the characters says, I don't want to, I just want to be myself. So that kind of theme was quite an interesting one to explore.
Awesome. Astrid?
My story explores many, many different aspects, so that's really fun. I think the biggest one is that, like, what I do in my story, humans came from this universe to that universe through some sort of apocalypse kind of thing. And the humans that made it through, obviously not all of them are going to be like a-holes and stuff like that, but a lot of the ones that came through brought along their bigotries and self-centeredness and everything like that. And my world had never experienced stuff like that before until the humans arrived, and humans took over this one continent, Patan, and at first it's kind of like what they did to our Native Americans, where the native population of Patan was like, oh hey, deal with this. Well, and the natives of the planet itself, they all extended their help to the humans, and then eventually humans took over Patan and created two countries. One is Strana, the other one's what I call corporate states of Patan, which is a nod at the United States. And they do a lot of things that America does, but my story focuses on one of the native kind of Inarian population, and a lot of my main character and many others think like her, like, why are humans like this? Why did they come along with all this stuff? And it's different because a lot of stories make it the orcs are the bad guys, and I decided, what, let's flip the tables. Humans are the bad guys. They came from our place, or our world and brought along their crap, and and they started trying to control the other countries also with the council of sorcerers to kind of make other countries follow specific laws about magic, even though we never had that before in Anaros. But when the humans came, they brought that kind of stuff with them. And they also brought police, which I tackle, the police also, like, hey, this is kind of screwed up. One in the beginning, Caden, my main character, or one of the main characters, he's a minister of foreign affairs, and he was dealing a case where a human in corporate states of Patan, an orc, had been attacked and brutalized outside of the embassy because he's an orc, and when humans came, they, like I said, they brought along their bigotries, and one of them was that orcs are always the bad guys. And like, I take on a lot of different things in my story, but I feel like the humans are the biggest one that I tackle.
I really appreciate that. I would say the worst monsters are always human. But I am going to cut you off there because we do only have a few minutes left. I'm in charge, so like we can run over a couple minutes. That's part of why I like to leave half an hour between sessions, but I don't want to run over too much. So we have a question from Chrissy, who says, I write paranormal romances, but I choose to use pretty triggering aspects from real life. But since the characters, this is fantasy and they do overcome them. But how do you guys handle really triggering concepts? And I think this is talking about like, how do you handle it in a way that is sort of sensitive and something that is, it's still, you are still tackling the subject head on, but you are also, creating a space that readers are still able to engage with and not like so triggered that they have to put your book down.
Please don't make me go first again.
We love you, Micah.
I found it interesting. Melody Harper book, which was sci-fi, I dealt with a lot of dark themes and I dealt with them quite deeply. And yeah, I found with my fantasy world, I could sometimes just touch a bit to mention that something had gone on, but not to the level. I think when I did Melody Harper, my commitment to the dark issues was such that if I'm going to introduce something, for starters, I'd put in a content warning. We had a whole other a trigger warning at the front of the book, but also to not just introduce a theme just for it to be some kind of plot point or some kind of salacious detail. If you're going to do something, if something's going to be a bit dark, you need to commit to it and actually explore it, and not just go, hey, this really shitty thing happens, but oh, plot point, da da da, and then just kind of never pick on it. I know for me, for instance, there's in book one, there's a sexual assault that happens, which is really dark, and it was and it's there in the content warnings, but I commit to the rest of the books kind of saying that, this thing happened and this character is still dealing with the knock-on of that. It's not simply it happens and then we never talk about it again. And to represent the fact that the journey through trauma is a long one as well. It's not literally you have heart to heart with somebody and then it all just goes away. And I even do that with the epilogue where like 20 years on, it's still, they mention it's still a thing as they recount the events to the daughter. So I think that is that commitment. And when you take on a subject like that, trying to keep it quick, is make sure that, you explore from your own experience. That's definitely something I did for that, but also that you touch base with, making sure that you are approaching it kind of sensitively.
Yeah, I think integrating it, I think that's really good, Mike. I think integrating it into the character's story and into the kind of the broader context of the world in which you're creating can help in terms of approaching it more sensitively. I love horror and writing horror, and there is, there are obviously there are examples within the horror genre where it's just shock value, where there's a load of stuff going on, and you're sort of thinking, what's even the purpose or the point of this, and sometimes there isn't. In some ways you can say, well, is there something for that? Because if you look around the world, sometimes suffering happens and there is no meaning to it. That is a reality. I've known things to happen where you can't draw any meaning out of it. It's meaningless. It's awful and it's horrible. And so I understand that kind of concept, but for me, I feel like it needs to be integrated into the character's life and story and into the broader themes of the world that you're creating. But also as writers, I'm not, I might be controversial, I'm not 100% convinced about the, show don't tell thing. Like, I get it, and there is an argument for that. But you can say a lot without saying a lot, and that's the other powerful thing about being a good writer. There's an awful lot you can say without really saying anything. And that's a way that you can sensitively handle some of these darker themes as well, by a hint or a suggestion or a nod. That can actually cut really deep, but also keep people from being too triggered. But also, obviously, content warnings, trigger warnings are really, really important, I think, at beginnings of books. So,
yeah, I agree. Definitely using trigger warnings. And then I think, too, just focusing, like what Micah said, focusing, I think, more on the effects, the aftermath, treating it as like a heavy topic. I don't think that means that you necessarily need to go into graphic details. Of course, this does kind of depend on what the triggering event was, but I think a lot of times, like, people have this idea that, like, oh, like, in order to show how horrible this is, I need to, like, go into, like, graphic detail. I don't think that's necessarily as effective as showing how much it affects someone. So I think if you want to handle something with grace, but also treating it as this is a serious issue, like, it's not something that's over as soon as it's done. It has lasting repercussions. Focus on that. We don't need to go into the weeds of it necessarily. Again, it does kind of depend on what the triggering issue is. I think too, it depends in part too on kind of the author's own experiences. I know a lot of people write about their own experiences through fiction, and I think that's slightly separate, but yeah.
I do think it also depends on like subgenre and like age category. Like the rules are going to be different if you're writing middle grade versus adult fiction. They're going to be different if you're trying to write like a somewhat lighter fantasy story versus if you're leaning full into fantasy horror, Like if you're going for the horror vibe with your fantasy, you're going to probably end up being more graphic on the details. I wouldn't know anything about that from experience or anything. I don't write extremely graphic violence. Astrid, your thoughts?
I agree with everyone, especially the trigger warning thing. That's what I put content warnings. I try not to get into too much triggering stuff, but I do say, add those trigger warnings because your audience will thank you for that. And again, you want to talk about these triggering things, and depending on your audience, you might have, like, if you're talking, I talk about mental health in my thing, and especially anxiety and PTSD, because one of my characters, actually two of my characters, has PTSD. You got to write it depending on your audience. You might have to kind of talk about these kinds of things in a way your audience will understand. If it's middle grade, you've got little ones reading, and you have to put it into words that they understand. But if you get really you don't want to get too terribly graphic if you're writing middle grade like me, or sometimes even YA, but that also depends on the genre, because if you're writing horror, that's a little bit of a different story, I think. I don't know, because I don't write horror. I am actually a bit of a chicken when it comes to horror. But and then you also do have to talk about these things in a way that is respectful of people in who also deal with these things, because I don't know if I actually do have PTSD, but I can't write the kind of PTSD that my characters have because they fought in a war. So like those kinds of things, you got to write it being sensitive to those who have it. So some things you might have to just straight up research so you don't cause any problems with your writing. So
Also potentially getting
Yeah.
sensitivity readers, I think, depending
yeah,
on
sensitivity readers, I tend to go out and ask people, what do you think about this? So like sensitivity readers, definitely. Sometimes you can, if you know some people, definitely talk to them. Like if you know someone with PTSD or has experienced X sensitive topic, talk to them. I don't think many would have a problem. I mean, obviously, there are people who will like not feel comfortable with that, but definitely try to talk to people who've experienced these things. And if you're not sure, again, sensitivity readers. I hope I did not make that sound weird.
Not that makes sense to me. And I will just add that if you don't know anyone, like a lot of people of all kinds are already out here sharing our stories, their stories on social media. You know, like when I started writing about a character who was blind, I found blind YouTubers. Like everyone is trying to tell their story. If you just look for people, you will find them. They are out there. This video is a recording of a panel from the event Storycrafting Sessions Fantasy, a free one-day virtual conference hosted by the Weeknight Writers Group in partnership with Renaissance Press. To learn more about the Weeknight Writers Group, you can go to businessforauthors.com/weeknight-writers, and to learn more about Renaissance Press, you can go to pressesrenaissancepress.ca.